took to wearing white cockades of paper in their hats, whereas the Williamites wore sprigs of green.
Both armies were destined to meet at the great Battle of the Boyne in the Valley of the King.
These stones predate the pyramids and mark the burial place of Ireland's ancient kings. In 1690, they were witness to a decisive military encounter between James II and William III, who were fighting for control of the British throne. They would come face to face on the banks of the River Boyne.
William was the figurehead of resistance against Louis XIV and Catholic France. The European alliance rallied behind him, giving him troops and supplies for his crusade. Even the Pope wished to see Louis's powers curtailed and helped sponsor his mission. William landed in Ireland on the 14th of June 1690. His army and that of James II were on a crash course to decide the future of Europe.
Just to the north of Dundalk, detachments from both sides met at the Moiree Pass. After an indecisive skirmish, James knew he was facing a better equipped and substantially larger army than his own. His French advisors told him to burn Dublin and retreat to the relative safety of the west coast. But the morale of his men was high, and James made the decision to stand and fight.
James searched for the best location from which to establish his defence of Dublin and the rich lands of southern and eastern Ireland. He chose the best natural obstacle available and deployed his troops in the S-bend of the River Boyne, just outside Drogheda, also known as the Valley of the Kings.
Placing his headquarters on the high ground to the south of the river, James had a fine view of William's approach from the north. He had a total of 26,000 troops at his disposal, keeping a mobile reserve of cavalry, dragoons, and French troops behind him around Dunor. He placed his infantry in defensive positions along the riverbank, covering the most likely crossing point at Oldbridge. He then blew up the only bridge nearby at Slane.
A large, impenetrable bog protected James's left flank. With its steep sides and treacherous ground, it provided a perfect natural obstacle against William, should he succeed in crossing the river upstream. But James wasn't convinced the bog could do its job, so he sent a detachment of 400 dragoons to act as his eyes and ears on the left flank.
William's army arrived just to the north of the Boyne on the last day of June and immediately started to bombard the Jacobite positions. His generals fiercely argued as to where the main thrust of the attack should be. William decided to go and have a look for himself.
William went down to the river in full sovereign's regalia. Whilst checking the height of the river, he was spotted by a couple of James's horse artillerymen, who quickly loaded their cannon and rather opportunistically loosed off a couple of rounds at the king. The first went wide of him, killing one of his soldiers and a couple of horses, but the second ricocheted off the bank of the river and hit the king a glancing blow on the shoulder, knocking him off his horse, wounding him. A great cheer went up from James's troops, but amazingly, William got up, remounted and went off to inspect his men, hurt but intact.
Later that evening, William convened his council of war and informed his generals that he intended to attack on two fronts, at Oldbridge, where the river was fordable, and with a flanking movement across the bridge at Slane.
At 5 a.m. the following morning, 10,000 men, a third of William's army, left for Slane under the cover of wood and fog. They streamed past these tombs of the ancient Irish kings, led by Marshal Schomberg's son, Meinhard. Their objective was to cross the river below and catch James's army in a pincer movement with the rest of the Williamite forces crossing the river at Oldbridge.
On reaching Slane, Schomberg found the bridge blown, but soon located a section of the river where they could cross. On the bank facing them were James's 400 Irish dragoons. At around 6 a.m, Schomberg sent 100 mounted grenadiers supported by Dutch dragoons to cross the river. James's men had no chance against the 17th century equivalent of the SAS. They were decimated by the superior flintlock firepower of William's elite troops.
The remainder of Marshal Schomberg's force followed the vanguard down into the valley and crossed the river completely unopposed. But their advance soon came to a halt when they encountered the bog that protected James's left flank.
James received news of Schomberg's successful crossing of the river. He immediately assumed the worst, that William's troops would find a way through the bog and hit him on the left flank. Leaving Tyrconnell and the Irish infantry at Oldbridge, he led the rest of his army onto the ground above the bog and waited for Schomberg's men to attack. Over 20,000 men were to remain on either side of the bog without taking any part in the battle. By rushing to protect his left flank, James had weakened the centre of the Jacobite line.
William, meanwhile, decided to throw the bulk of his army across the river at Oldbridge. At 10 a.m, 3 battalions of his beloved Dutch Guards marched into the waist-deep waters of the Boyne, with drums playing and standards flying. Despite the fierce musket fire from the Jacobites on the other side, they quickly reached the south side of the river, where the Irish infantry fell upon them with sickles, swords and pikes. The fighting was so fierce, reported one observer, that many old soldiers never saw brisker work.
William's better trained and better equipped infantry soon pushed the valiant but outnumbered Irish infantry up the riverbank to the southern outskirts of Oldbridge. Tyrconnell, James's Irish deputy, saw the Dutch Guards without cover and immediately countercharged with a huge force of Jacobite cavalry.
Watching through his telescope, William saw his beleaguered Dutch Guards form up into squares before disappearing beneath a fog of gun smoke and flashing steel. Muttering, "My poor guards, my poor guards," he then launched the Danish and French Huguenots into the breach.
On reaching the south bank, these regiments were also held and even repulsed by Tyrconnell's cavalry. The commander of the Huguenots was killed and his men began to falter. Despite being 70 years old, Marshal Schomberg charged to the front and tried to rally the Protestant soldiers, screaming, "There are your persecutors!" But he too was cut down.
Neither of the Schombergs had achieved the result William needed, and he now faced defeat. Although wounded from the day before and asthmatic as he was, William decided to throw himself into the fight as the battle reached its climax. Bringing cannon down to the river for cover, he now made his way across, just downstream from Oldbridge.
Placing himself at the head of a substantial force of cavalry, he charged the Jacobite right flank, already weakened by hours of bloody combat. The whole Irish defensive line broke under the pressure and fled out of Oldbridge, back up the hill towards Dunor. The tide was finally turning in William's favour.
In the confusion of fighting around Dunor, the sprigs of green and white cockades of identification were not enough to prevent what's known nowadays as blue-on-blue engagements or friendly fire. William's Ulstermen fired upon their Huguenot allies. One of them even cocked a pistol at the king, who replied, "What? Are you angry at your friends?"
William then took direct command of the Ulstermen with the cry, "You shall be my guards today. I have heard much of you. Let me see something of you." The proud Ulstermen fought on next to their king as the battle descended into a bloody rout. The Irish infantry were slaughtered as they fled, whilst their cavalry fought a desperate retreating battle back along the Dublin road.
In shocking contrast to William's direct action, James's next move was more concerned with safety rather than victory. Hearing of the retreat from Oldbridge and suspecting Meinhard Schomberg of pushing further south in order to totally encircle his army, James decided to flee the battlefield and abandon his army.
With James gone, the retreat quickly got out of hand. Such was the haste of the Jacobite cavalry to escape, they even killed some of their own troops on the congested roads leading back to Dublin. William had lost as few as 500 men. In stark contrast, the Jacobites suffered over 1,500 casualties. Is it any wonder James became known in Ireland as Seamus an Shaka, James the Shithead?
On reaching Dublin, James is said to have told Lady Tyrconnell that the Irish infantry ran away, to which she replied, "Well, it is you, sir, who have won the race." James kept on running, all the way to France, never to return to Britain again.
In James's absence, the war dragged on for another year. But the Irish no longer fought in support of the king who had deserted them. William was determined never to be troubled by Ireland again, and when the fighting finally stopped, the country was subjected to a series of brutal reprisals.
As a result of this great battle, William was to eventually destroy the shadow of tyranny that Louis XIV cast across Europe, whilst he held Britain's hand as it stepped onto the stage as a world superpower.